So I think military veterans are such an interesting case because there's work, there's specifically work in HRMR Stone, and Stone 2015 is one of my go-to resources for the dimensions of stigma as they may relate to military veterans. And what's really interesting about veterans is that there are both positively valenced and negatively valenced assumptions. There's 6 dimensions of stigma, and sometimes in the work that I do, sometimes I've seen that female military veterans actually get a boost. Thinking about the workplace implications, one of the obvious implications to me is just, can we get more people who have been historically left out of our workplaces into our workplaces? And as a community, as a society, I think we owe it to each other to find ways that those who have been marginalized among us can contribute meaningfully to our workplaces. And it's just better for all of us in our long-term working lives, but also our post-working lives. So yeah, I could not agree more that looking for non-traditional workers is definitely one of my main messages when talking to employers about how to be more creative or get over turnover issues, which oftentimes do come up.
Good evening, Professor.
You are Professor Christy, and you graduated from Rice University with your Ph.D. in organizational psychology, and you are an assistant professor in management with a specialization in OB, organization behavioral psychology, in Texas Tech University now. And your main research interest is stigma theory, Allyship, and identity management at workplace. That's the broad idea of your research interest. And thank you for joining me.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk all things DE&I.
Thank you. So let's start with stigma theory. So what is stigma theory? And is it just a bookish concept, or it has some real life implication, or can we see these implications of this theory in real life?
Yeah, great question. So stigma theory is one of the theories I often turn to because it's sort of the foundations of where we start when we're developing arguments around the experiences of minoritized identities in management papers and organizational behavior papers. And originally, the author of stigma theory is Erving Goffman, who published Management of a Spoiled Identity in about the early 1960s. And there's a few editions of the paper, of the book. And it's a really great read because it theoretically helps us understand why perceivers react to individuals with stigmatized identities in the way that they do. And I remember when I first started reading the book, I've always been interested in all sorts of minoritized social identities, but in particular, people with disabilities. And it was very uncanny how even just in the first 20 pages or so, I thought Erving Goffman really captured what the experience was like, not only from anticipating target reactions, which is what we call the individual with a stigmatized identity in my field, but also how the perceivers react, and particularly whether a stigmatized identity is visible or invisible. And then there's all these different ways that we can potentially discount people on the basis of our preconceptions. So I thought that was a really, it just really resonated with me. And it's oftentimes where I start, particularly when I'm trying to introduce research or write research about an identity that's particularly underrepresented, not only in the workplace, but in our management literature. So that's where stigma theory originates, but there's all sorts of other wonderful scholars who have extended Erving Goffman's work, and one of them, his last name is Jones, and he has a very interesting paper in 1984 that talks about the 6 dimensions of stigma. And I really like that paper coupled with Erving Goffman's work because it talks about all the dimensions upon which stigma can vary that are very unique and nuanced to the type of stigma that you're thinking about, even more so than is it visible or invisible. But some of the dimensions, for example, are, does it sort of incept ideas of peril? Is it disruptive? Are there elements of controllability? So I think those two sources together are oftentimes the places I like to start when thinking about how not only targets, but also perceivers of targets interpret various stigmatized identities.
I see. So you spoke about this discounting of an individual not based on his or her capacities, but certain identities, right? Can you give me an example, a real life example that we can see in the real world, or we can relate to that particular example?
Yeah, one example from a paper, a fairly recent paper that I was on with a team, are military veterans. So I think military veterans are such an interesting case because there's specifically work in HRMR Stone and Stone 2015 is one of my go-to resources for the dimensions of stigma as they may relate to military veterans. And what's really interesting about veterans is that there are both positively valenced and negatively valenced assumptions. So if you think about veterans, we think, they have, we perceive them to be heroes. We feel a lot of admiration toward them, but there's other stigmatized elements of their identities that are rolled in, including expectations or assumptions around their mental health. And so we might be concerned that they may be very unpredictable from minute to minute. We might have safety, or tying back to the Jones et al. 1984 paper, concerns about peril. And so I found that to be a really interesting juxtaposition. And in the paper that I was on a team that we published, the last name is Xu, XU, on the team, and that's the first author, and it was published in 2022 in Personnel Psychology. And what we wanted to examine was that if a veteran's PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder was discovered, if that would influence how hiring managers perceived that individual, particularly if that individual wasn't the source of the disclosure. Because so often in our really interconnected world with social media these days, people are able to discover a lot more about individuals, particularly when they're under evaluation, than they have been in the past. And what we found that was cool, I thought, in that, wow, this is very interesting that we've been able to track this phenomenon. A little discouraging because it doesn't work out so well for veterans, but I think gives us some ideas for how to protect against this or anticipate these reactions in the future, which is that when hiring managers discover a military veteran's PTSD, they do end up expecting less of them in the hiring process, whether that be in the case of counterproductive work behaviors or task performance. So I think that's a pretty interesting case, because I don't think anyone would hope that a military veteran who has served their country for X number of years gets out of the military and tries to transition to the civilian workforce and then has these really negative workplace experiences. I think we all really feel that we owe our military veterans a lot and we want to see them succeed, but it's a much more complex process than that. And practically, it has some really important real world implications, particularly since so many of us have military veterans in our family and friend groups.
Yes. So I'm going to come back to this particular point for the stigma theory and implications for workforce and management, etc. But you, in the first part, you touched upon an important point that stigma is not unidimensional; it has many dimensions. Right. So, can you talk about that? What are the dimensions? You spoke about that a little bit, but I would like to know how those multidimensional stigma points, or what is the intersectionality of these various points?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. So there's 6 dimensions of stigma, and let's see how good I am off the cuff if I can remember all of them. But controllability is certainly one, and I think it's a really relevant one given the conversation around veterans and mental health, because I've done a few papers around various types of disabilities. We do have different expectations around controllability, but also there's sort of adjacent dimensions such as legitimacy of a disability. So depression, anxiety, typically mental health conditions we perceive as, on average, being less legitimate than some of the other disabilities, such as a physical disability, ones that are a little bit more tangible. And I can trace us down the whole road of how mental health or mental illnesses have been perceived over time that sort of justify that origin story. But that's just one example of even like subdimensions that can kind of differ. Even if we're just restricting our conversation to one type of stigma, that being disability, it's again an area of my research, but it's a very complex identity because it differs along so many different dimensions. But yes, I think the picture becomes quite complex when you're talking about intersectional identities, because if you're thinking about something such as peril or disruptiveness is one that I find really interesting. And what this dimension is about is if you're in a social interaction, is the stigma so noticeable or so interfering as to totally throw off people in an social interaction? And I've sort of taken this a little bit further when I talk about it in some of the work that I have, because I think of it almost akin, if you push it far enough, to disgust. And that can be really off-putting. And you can think about if people have, there's been work on people who have facial scars, even tattoos. People have different reactions to different types of stigma. And if you have multiple stigmas, then people are trying to put you into a smaller and smaller box. And suddenly these dimensions are intersecting in a way that makes it almost overwhelmingly complex for a perceiver to contend with. And I think I haven't done research on this, but I would bet that the more intersectional identities, marginalized, minoritized intersectional identities that an individual has, just the more generally they are negatively perceived due to the complexity of trying to disentangle all of the stereotypes and all of the negative affects that we might feel on the basis of these varying dimensions.
So basically, these 6 dimensions can come together, and it will basically compound the negative effect of these basic negative effect of stigmas. That's what we are talking about.
Yeah, and there's other dimensions. I don't want to make it sound like this is the end all be all, but it is where I go to start. And I think based on the type of minoritized identity, that governs the types of stigmas that are relevant. So if I was thinking about gender, for example, I do a lot of work on gender as well. And there's one paper I'm working on right now that I've been really figuring out, like, how do I, like, what's at play? Like, I know that there is disadvantage, but how do I position this theoretically? And like gender stereotypes, as basic and sort of obvious of a positioning as that seems, are really powerful. So it's sort of, I just want to underline the point that it really depends on the identity of interest, the types of dimensions that may be most applicable. And, there's broad bodies of literature that sort of diverge depending on the type of identity that can help you narrow that down.
I see. So let me break down what you said. So let's say there is a woman, there is a female candidate, and there is a female who is a veteran candidate. So the negative effect for the second candidate will be more because of these workplace dynamics as compared to the first candidate who is just female, who is not a veteran.
So I wish it was that simple. I wish it was additive. But again, veterans are an interesting identity because there are positive valences about their identity and negative valences. So the work that I've done and the work that I've seen around gender, again, I just want to caution that this is like 1 or 2 studies. So I'm not trying to say that this is what the whole literature suggests, but sometimes in the work that I do, sometimes I've seen that female military veterans actually get a boost. And I think I honestly, I'm still wrestling with why that might be, but I think it's because women, if we're just thinking about women candidates, women versus men, women are, generally like they're perceived as more communal. They have to kind of like boost up their competence, particularly if their feminine characteristics are especially salient. And I think with female veterans, that like veteran piece is that legitimized agentic piece that gives them that expertise and gravitas in a way that's more believable sometimes. So I'll just say that it's not, these are unfortunately, it's not like a linear process of accumulation of disadvantage or a linear process of accumulation of advantage. It really depends on the identity, and even different identities intersect in different ways. So if you were trying to think about a cumulative disadvantage across multiple identities, I would think about in the U.S. context, I would think about Black Americans. So if you think about like a Black woman versus a white woman, then yes, I would expect to see the disadvantage accumulate in the way that you described.
Okay. So that's great. So you touched upon this workforce or labor consequences of the stigma theory. What are the examples of that particular implication for labor force?
Well, I will say a lot of times when I study these populations, one of my favorite first things to do is to just look at the employment rate. Because a lot of times the populations I'm interested in are those that are the most dismally employed. So a lot of times, like people with cognitive disabilities that I'm often interested in, or like mental health disabilities, their unemployment rate is usually like 85% or higher. Another group that I'm interested in, that some of my students have also taken an interest in, are individuals with criminal records, and their unemployment rate is even higher. So I think when thinking about the workplace implications, one of the obvious implications to me is just, can we get more people who have been historically left out of our workplaces into our workplaces? Because none of the other more downstream organizational variables matter if they're not making it through the selection and recruitment process. So I really do love research on retention. I do some of that research as well. But so many of the populations I'm interested in have just been so historically left out of the workplace that I do spend a good deal of time investigating the context and just sort of the mechanisms that are at play in the hiring and selection process. Because if we can't affect change there, then none of the other downstream variables, unfortunately, really matter for those individuals.
Yes. And especially this leftover labor force is very important right now, because the labor force is so tight and wages are going so up, and it is one of the many contributing factors to the inflation, right? So
Yes, and it's so because I say disability, one thing that I've really noticed in the last few years is like this idea around employees who are neurodiverse is really taking off, and I find it very encouraging. Let me just be clear. I'm so happy to see this, but also a little incredulous, because I'm like, these people have always been there. They've always been able to contribute. Okay, we're not going to criticize. We're just happy that people are recognizing them. But they are a tremendous source of talent. And also, I think another thing we need to factor in from a community-based perspective is, work is what adults spend the majority of their time doing. It provides a lot of meaning to our lives, and it provides basic needs such as economic self-sufficiency. And as a community, as a society, I think we owe it to each other to find ways that those who have been marginalized among us can contribute meaningfully to our workplaces. And it's just better for all of us in our long-term working lives, but also our post-working lives. So yeah, I could not agree more that looking for non-traditional workers is definitely one of my main messages when talking to employers about how to be more creative or get over turnover issues, which oftentimes do come up because one of the areas that I research is entry-level positions.
Yes. So basically, this particular portion of the labor force, our labor force, they need to be in the labor force. Actually, they should get work. It is not just a diversity issue. It is an economic issue. It is a human rights issue. It is a human health.
Exactly.
As well, right? There are so many flows that come from that origin, right? So how do we counter these implications of, how do we oppose these forces of stigma theory? Can we reduce it?
Yes. We always say, the lab that I was raised in and my colleagues When we find something in our research, it's always a catch-22. Like, oh, wow, the phenomenon we're interested in is there. Like, from a research and publication perspective, that's wonderful. From a social justice community perspective, that's not great. Like, we don't love to find, evidence of discrimination. And then, the counterpoint is, well, if you don't find it, well, at least, there's not evidence of discrimination there. But I think, yes, there are many things that both individuals who are stigmatized and allies or perceivers or bystanders can do. Regarding the actual individuals themselves, I will just say that it is definitely not my view that like the onus of solving this problem should rest squarely on their shoulders. I absolutely think that majority members need to take on responsibility and contribute in a positive way to affect change in terms of this problem. But I think there's some really great research that talks about my other area of research, identity management theory, which talks about when you have a visible stigma, we call that when you talk about it, when someone can observe something minoritized about you, and you talk about it, we call that acknowledgement. And then there are other identities, the identities that I spend most of my time conducting research on, which are the invisible identities. And those people can choose to disclose them or not. And when they talk about them, we call that disclosure. And so what we know is that there are different ways that people can acknowledge or disclose their identity, their marginalized identity, in like an interview setting, for example, that are more or less effective. So the research suggests that if you have a visible identity and you're in an evaluative setting, it is better to address the elephant in the room because it's taking everyone's cognitive resources to think about it. And the suggestion is that middle to the end of the interview is the best time to acknowledge it. However, the advice is different if you have an invisible identity. If you have an invisible identity that isn't really going to even come up in a 30-minute interview or in a 30-minute evaluative setting, there's no need to put yourself at a disadvantage when it's not even observable by the evaluators. So the suggestion is often to not disclose a stigmatized identity until you have a job offer. And then you can move forward with requesting accommodations or whatever you need to do, figuring out who to trust, who you feel safe to disclose that identity to, and hopefully you're in a supportive organizational culture. But that really is, quite, puts a lot of pressure on the individual. So there's so many things that allies can do. And in fact, I have a paper right now examining allies who represent job candidates with stigmas in the hiring process to hiring managers. And there are different strategies that allies can use that are more effective than others when they're presenting a stigmatized candidate to a hiring manager. And that's really exciting for me personally, because as we mentioned at the beginning, I have a master's degree in special education from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And one of the things, the job roles that I served when I was doing my graduate studies there, was I worked as a job specialist. And this oftentimes did mean going around and cold calling organizations and trying to drop in on hiring managers to pitch a candidate or to just get them familiar with a candidate and see if we could place them in a job. And it is one of the most just stressful experiences that I had in graduate school, because somebody else's employment rests on, basically your acumen and your position. And so having some details on experimentally tested strategies that are more effective, I would have killed for that in that role. So I'm excited to say that, yes, it looks like there is some evidence that there are some strategies that are more effective. And another thing we know is that witnessed discrimination negatively affects bystanders just as much as it affects targets. There are negative implications for everyone who witnesses discrimination. So really a lot of research is moving into this direction, thinking how can bystanders speak up? What does an ally? How do we differentiate bystanders from allies? And what are the strategies that they can do that can make them sort of agents of change? And I will just say that one caution here is that sometimes majority members have really good intentions and don't execute super well. So definitely something that we do in my research is confirming or checking with individuals who are minoritized that the strategy that we think is helpful actually is helpful. And, no two individuals are the same. So I think that that's something that we have to build into our allyship, but also thinking about how do we, enhance or promote minoritized individuals, which sometimes means, speaking less or doing less to amplify others. And that can be sometimes counterintuitive to people who historically just have always had that privilege. It's a little bit, of a switch to think about that a little differently.
So you mentioned that
The effects of discrimination can be on the victim as well as on the bystanders. So even if I'm not, let's say I'm not a member of a minority, I can feel the heat of this discrimination, right? So that's why I should be active in being ally of those victims, right?
so what can I do as a member of, let's say,
Bystanders.
to stand with these victims?
Yeah, so I think two reasons, right? I mean, if we live in an ethical workplace, believe in an ethical society, certainly I would argue that it's not right to stand by while someone else experiences discrimination or is targeted in a negative way. So I certainly feel, an individual responsibility to try and do something to help, and I think that is shared by so many people. So yeah, in the research that I have, we look at 4 strategies. We look at a control strategy where it's sort of nothing is disclosed about a candidate and someone's just like talking them up versus a strategy that's exactly the same, but where the stigmatized identity of the candidate is disclosed versus a strategy where like we make this business case, because so many people I talk to in practice believe that like the business case is the way to the future of including people in organizations. So we acknowledge the stigma, we make this business case, and then the 4th condition, we acknowledge the stigma, and then we make the moral case, which is essentially like this is the right thing to do. Businesses were basically given their purview from communities, so they owe communities a responsibility to look out after them. Contrasted with the business case, which is like hiring these individuals is good for your bottom line. You'll make money. It'll be, net neutral or if anything positive for you. And what I found in some of this ongoing research is that the moral case and the simple disclosure case specifically wind up being more positive than the business case or the control. And I will say in the first field study I did, like business and the moral case were kind of a little bit neck and neck. But when we had more downstream, more proximal variables, it was clear that people, again, without asking them, without knowing the mechanism, my interpretation of the results is that they seem to be somewhat put off by the business case. And I'm pretty encouraged by that because it seems like we are trained or enculturated to not really give people the benefit of the doubt and that assume that like everyone's self-interested and in it for themselves. And really what we've been finding is that no, in fact, I think people might be kind of offended if you make that assumption. And if you give people the ability to do something good and humane, they want to. So that research is ongoing, but that's where I'm at right now. And I've been kind of encouraged by those findings.
Okay, I think that's a great finding, and it is surprising to me as well because my
Degrees in economics, and I'm kind of less enthusiastic,
less happy about the finding, but I think overall it is a good finding that people
care about moral compass, not just bottom line.
Yes, and certainly there are like boundary conditions and context and things, but I think at an individual level, there's been some research, not just mine, that suggests that when you appeal to a supervisor and you make this moral case, particularly some of this other research has tied it to the mission of the organization. We can tie it to like social responsibility, for example. It's particularly effective, and I do find that really encouraging.
I'm happy to hear that result. So let's. So you are working in a business school.
I'm working in a business school. So one of your paper discusses about this disparity between women speakers and male speakers, right?
Can we talk more about that? What was the research paper about? What did you find?
Yeah, so I am working in a business school, but I did come out of an industrial organizational psychology Ph.D. program. So I point that out because like the gender representation in those two contexts is very different. So in psychology program, the majority, at least in my experience in this paper, it tends to be on parity or even majority female. So there's a lot of like female graduate students. That's not necessarily the case always among faculty, but I'd say it's more the case than in business schools. But in business schools, my experience has been that it's much more either 50-50 men or more men, and particularly more men in faculty positions. So the idea was that we were seeing these speakers and it was really exciting, and we would have a speaker every week. But just there, we had a string of like male speakers, and it was just quite a juxtaposition because we had so many women in the room that it was sort of poignant. And so we wanted to investigate, like, is this just a N of one phenomenon, or is this something that's more widespread? So looking at 6 disciplines, and we really wanted to look at disciplines that had not just gender parity, but some that had more women and some that had more men, so that we were kind of accounting for the spectrum of representation. And across the 6 disciplines we looked at, we found that there were more male speakers, even when we controlled for faculty rank, and when we controlled for discipline, and even when we controlled for the number of people in the pool. So we went back and we collected a huge data set of all the people that could have been selected as speakers. And even when we factored in that composition into our analyses, men were still giving 1.2 talks to the 1 talk that a woman was giving. And maybe that doesn't sound like huge. Like maybe that sounds like, okay, well, that's unfortunate, but it's, it's close. But the problem becomes disadvantage that accumulates. So a little bit of disadvantage here and a little bit of disadvantage there accumulates to a lot. And there have been some really cool gender pay studies that have demonstrated, like, even if a woman is making like $1,000 less a year than a man, this can add up to like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars over the lifetime. So I would make the same argument about talks, which are extremely important if you're an academic in terms of visibility, citations of your work, job opportunities, collaborations. There's so many ways that these talks are really advantageous to academics. And I talk about this paper with my students, and they're always like, what is a talk? So I always tell them, I'm like, listen, it's like a paid 2 to 3 day trip to a campus where you get to meet with all these faculty members, and you give a talk to a place that wants to hear what you have to say on a subject and is highly motivated to attend and engage with you, which is a really unique and wonderful audience. So anyways, this is what we found in study 1, but there are all these like, yeah, but assumptions. So, but like the women are saying no, or like, yeah, but like they have too many family responsibilities. Like the family responsibilities is what's like driving this difference. So we surveyed 2 groups of faculty, those that gave talks and those that didn't, and the results were null across both, which were in our favor, which was we were trying to see if there was a gender difference and how important people thought giving talks. And there was no gender difference across either sample. On average, faculty members give about, or decline rather, about half a talk. So giving talks is important to people, and they try to say yes when they can. So then in the 3rd study, we wanted to connect the deciders, really the inviters, to the pool. So we went back and we connected with all the administrators in the departments at which we collect data that we could, and asked them, like, in this year, who was the person who was making the decision on colloquium invitees, or who was the committee, and like what was the gender makeup. And so based on that data that we got, we were able to connect that to our archival data, and we found that when it was an individual that was inviting speakers, there was a significantly increased likelihood that the speakers invited would be female if that individual was also a female. And we found in the case that it was committees making the decision, there was a marginally significant likelihood that if the committee was greater composition female, that they'd be more likely to invite female speakers, which I think is pretty interesting. And when I talk about these results with different groups of people, one thing I've been very encouraged by is that the men will actually respond to me. They'll be like, that is so interesting. And if I was just directed to try and think of women, I could think of so many competent, phenomenal women that we should invite. It's almost this idea of we just need to be like prompted to know there's a disparity in this context. So let's try not to perpetuate that disparity. And really, that can really make a world of difference. And I just love getting that response, because we need men, we need male allies to help us with this work. Like women cannot address this problem by ourselves. So we need our male allies to also, take the shoulder of this work themselves.
Yes, that's interesting, and the results, of course, and people are
reacting positively to that result. That's more significant, I think. So you talked about this paper's sample selection, but I would like to raise another question. Let's say women, at least in STEM program, are coming lesser and lesser. Right? Their proportion in grad studies is significantly and statistically lesser than male counterparts, right? So maybe that's, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Maybe that is causing this disparity in the faculty selection, and maybe again that one step ahead, once these faculties get recruited, of course the disparity is there, and once they get called for these seminars, that basically I'm saying that the problem is not in the academia, maybe in the grad program or the way
I see what you're saying.
Admit students.
That's interesting. So I will say we did obviously control for faculty rank, which
Yes.
you would think if this was a problem with the pipeline, it would be magnified at higher levels. And we did not find evidence of that in a significant difference. And we also controlled for disciplines. So we collected data from biology departments at the top 50 universities in the US. And this was systemic across all 6 disciplines from which we collected data to try and address some of these issues. I will say I also, right now I have an NSF project looking at a discipline within, we call it STEAM now. And that has been pretty interesting because we just finished up last year an archival data collection effort. And that we collected graduate students and Ph.D. students and all the research scientists. Like we tried to really collect a wide swath because it was my assumption that we were going to see greater diversity in people who were at the lower status positions. And that is what we found. But there's something, and again, I hesitate to use this like leaky pipeline analogy, but there really is something about the matriculation from graduate student to postdoc to like research active faculty that is definitely happening in this field. And so we're actually experimentally testing an intervention that we hope provides some evidence that if you are intentional with your allyship, this will help address some of these challenges that some of these fields experience. The jury, I haven't analyzed those results yet. So the jury's out about the effect of that, but I certainly do not disagree that like there is a tremendous problem converting diversity or a diversely composed graduate student body to postdoc to faculty. There's absolutely we're bleeding people as they ascend the career ladder, and that's definitely something that I'm trying to hopefully like really isolate in some future work.
Perfect. So that brings us to diversity. So let's talk about what is DEI, where this particular movement or the term came from, and why is it important?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on kind of your community of who defines this term or how expansive it is. Excuse me. D is the diversity, E is the equity, and inclusion is the I. But other terms that people oftentimes like to bring into this conversation are B for belonging, or A for accessibility, and sometimes J for justice. And so I will say that the movement really took off in 2017 after the murder of George Floyd. And so I think, the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. started actually quite a bit before that. I'm working from memory here, but it's my understanding it was around 2013, 2014. And it was a movement that was founded by a group of Black mothers in the U.S. because it's not as, unfortunately, George Floyd's murder, because of social media, because of the video, it really captured in great detail, and several other murders in that same year, what atrocities were happening. But it wasn't as though these were the first atrocities that had happened. There had been historically many atrocities that had happened. It was just that year seemed to be the year where people really stood up and said, no more, this is really wrong.
Yes.
And that precipitated not only this field of diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations, but it also propelled the Black Lives Matter movement into immediate relevancy. It also precipitated, I would argue, the Me Too movement, which came a bit later and evolved into Time's Up in the UK, which focused on holding perpetrators of sexual harassment. And I would argue broadly, let's hold perpetrators of harassment broadly accountable, but in ways like high-profile perpetrators who have been protected by the system for a long time, holding them accountable. And that was extremely encouraging. As somebody who had been in the profession at that point as a graduate student, I can certainly say that I felt the shift in being at conferences and having 6 symposia to choose from that were in my subject area, to having more symposia and panels that I could ever go to in the same conference 4 years later. It really became, Fortune 500s began hiring and creating places for diversity, equity, and inclusion officers. Those officer or positions, in many cases, were tied to the executive suite and came with stock options. So there really was a surge in interest in this area. And then, unfortunately, in the last year, maybe year and a half, I would say, the incredulity has begun rolling in terms of people, trying to affect this change and maybe not doing so in an authentic way. But this has also been coupled, at least in the U.S., with political movements and changes that have been really challenging this field. And colleagues of mine have been writing some really cool articles about the science of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have an article under review right now about the science of diversity, equity, and inclusion, reminding everyone this isn't about opinions or attitudes. This is an empirical science that we make recommendations based on what we know works. So that's, I think, kind of catching up from where we were, where it started, what magnified it, what's attenuated it, and kind of where we are now.
So that's one point. So that's one point, that it is helping corporations and nonprofit and universities because of DEI, right? That's one part of the story. The second part of the story, or the refer to DEI movement, is this DEI movement may lead to tokenism. How do you address that particular criticism?
Yeah, so there's a really great paper that I love to talk to my students about when I talk about tokenism, and it's by Derek Avery. And again, working from memory, I believe it's in 2000. It was published in 2003. But it's really cool because they manipulated marketing materials, and I just extrapolate that to websites now because I think that's what students understand. But essentially, they portrayed an organization in marketing materials. And they had a condition that was just control homogenous, everyone was white and looked the same. Then they had a condition that was the tokenism, the skewed condition. And they portrayed one Black woman I think it was an entry-level position, but it was just very jarring. And then there was a third condition, and that was the balance condition. And out of the 5 people portrayed, my memory is that there were 2 Black women that were portrayed, or 2 Black candidates. And then, but it was across levels. So it wasn't just the case that all the representation was in the entry-level positions. It was actually, it spanned throughout the hierarchy of the organization. And so they asked Black prospective applicants to react to these stimuli. It was a 2-part study. I think in study 1, white and Black applicants, but in study 2, just Black applicants. And the findings that are interesting are, of course, the Black applicants. So what they reported was being really polarized by the skewed condition. And I think there's a number of reasons that I think we can, argue that this might be true. This seems very performative, very inauthentic. Also, you're kind of underlining that you have a lack of diversity, even more so than in this homogenous condition where it's really salient in this condition. And then the condition that appealed to them the most was the balance condition. And the mechanism that moderated this effect was how highly they identified with their in-group. So if they had high identification with their ethnic group, this effect was magnified. So they felt even more strongly for the balanced condition as opposed to the skewed condition. So I think this is a really important point. I've consulted for Fortune 500s who are dealing with this exact issue. And I think the advice we always give, I think, is very research-based, which is you can't change you can't change your status quo at the moment. Like, you are what you are, but to affect change, you have to appeal to the people that are not there to come on board, that you have an authentic commitment to this value, that this is an important value and you're making changes, and demonstrating an authentic commitment, in my experience, often involves not just like the words or the website, but actually putting financial resources, and again, not just financial resources, but time and effort into, manifesting your values outwardly. And so I think, like, yeah, it's a tokenism. Certainly, I've definitely been in situations where I'm the only woman in the room, and that affects how I participate. That affects how I feel included or that I belong. But I think, to a certain extent, that's just going to happen occasionally. And it's more about how majority members handle that situation, how they care for the individual who is minoritized. Do they tackle the elephant in the room? Do they check in? Like, is there an actual pulse on culture and belonging in that group or in that organization that eliminates all of those worries and concerns? So, I mean, I think it's unavoidable. Like, if we want to change, like, if, the first person is going to be, tokened, or the first group of people, they're going to experience tokenism. But I think you can handle that in a really productive way if you're proactive.
That's great. That's great. This was the first argument against diversity. But the second argument is, okay, this is reverse discrimination. This AOM movement undermines meritocracy. Recent evidence from the Harvard, what she was facing, the Claudia Gay episode, and Neil Ekman, what was his argument? He is the new crusader against DEI movement. So how do you respond to these particular issues?
Okay, so let me make sure I understood the argument. So I think the argument is because, for example, Claudia Gay, her scholarship has been called into question as like plagiarizing, and potentially her expertise is being seriously questioned. And thus the argument is that this was a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative that got this person to this position, not her credentials. Is that the argument?
Yes, and that hence it undermined the meritocracy of our such institution.
Right, the meritocracy argument. Yes, so I would never suggest to anyone, like when we do selection and hiring and recruitment, it should be a holistic process. I don't think I've ever heard of a hiring process that relies on only like one indicator of excellence. So ideally, there is a composite of an individual with measures that predict job performance or the thing that you care about. So you know that you're using valid predictors that ideally also reduce adverse impact, which are the group differences that reside within a measure that have nothing to do with actual predictive validity. So it's just group differences that doesn't relate to the validity of the measure to the outcome of interest, in this case, job performance. So I think so whenever I talk about this, I say, listen, all the research suggests a holistic hiring process is best. In fact, that's what the US legislation supports, a holistic hiring approach. And I think that obviously ability, expertise should be like the strongest predictor, but also we need to simultaneously take into account other measures that don't have adverse impact, that also have predictive validity, so that we make sure that our previous historical bias is not driving our decision making when we select people for positions. But no, and no minoritized candidate that I have ever talked to ever thinks that a diversity hire is a good thing. Like it undermines that person's credibility. It just really I've never heard a story about someone positioned like that converting into a really wonderful position with an organization with a long tenure. So I think the key being we need both. Like we need to hire with an eye towards expertise and ability, but we also need to hire with an eye toward how do we bring in diverse experiences and cultures and perspectives, because we know for all of these reasons that makes our organization better, but also these are measures that are predictive to our outcome of interest that don't squelch out the diversity that we're interested in.